there are many different ways in which I thought about starting this introduction. The first is obvious, but needs to be said and expressed sincerely, which is a great and sincere expression of thanks to you, not only for being so willing and eager from the outset to come and join us and to be here as a keynote speaker, but in fact, for years now, you've been an ardent and very, committed supporter of the work of the Tsikinya-Chaka Centre, and for 30 years, you have had a connection to Shakespeare in South and Southern Africa. That was going to be, I was going to elaborate on that connection until I saw Jyotsna's slides prior to today's session. She's going to be talking about that connection, and I'd rather she does that because it's both personal and intellectual, but it'll be wonderful for you to hear about that. It goes back to 1996 and the Shakespeare Postcoloniality Conference in Johannesburg. So there is a long-standing relationship with us, insofar as us is a South African Shakespearean group of people. Jyotsna, on a personal level, a personal note, I wanted to say thank you for everything that you've done to support and promote the work of the centre as well.
It's very important work. I'll talk about it.
And that fits into Jyotsna's general sort of modus operandi, which is to mentor and support and promote the work of others. We were having a sort of informal chat after the dinner last night. How many were we? We were only sort of 3 or 4. Colette and Marguerite and a few other people, and Jyotsna was sharing with us the people who she considers her mentors, and it's a terrible cliche to talk about paying it forward, but there's a really profound sense, I think, in which you've expanded and extended that generosity to many younger scholars and to your own peers as well, and that is requires a personal touch, but also an enormous intellectual project. And we, of course, have heard over the past day or two, as people have cited Jyotsna's work in her papers, of the impact of her scholarship. And that led me, because my dad was a Latin teacher, and I mean, if Shakespeare had little Greek and less Latin, or the other way around, I have none of either. But I do have these little snippets, these little sort of epigraphs, I guess, that I've inherited from him that always come to mind, and then I realize when I actually think of what they mean that they're completely inappropriate. So, and mostly they're kind of neoclassical rather than actually ancient. But of course, many of you will know the phrase "lector si monumentum requiris," right? Lector, in the instruction, look around you if you seek his or her monument. I thought, hang on, that sounds a little bit like something you would say at somebody's funeral, like an epitaph rather than an introduction. Instead, let me borrow the concept, but rephrase that to say we have, over the last couple of days, and we'll still again, I'm sure, today and tomorrow, be able to say, if we listen, we hear, in a sense, Jyotsna's monumental work around us and with us. And I started making notes yesterday when people were citing her and talking about her work. And then I thought it's actually probably just going to become a bit embarrassing if I remind the people who did that. So I'm not going to do that, but we all know of the impact of Jyotsna's work on the field and on many of our kind of scholarly journeys in particular. And I need not cite all of her publications, but that of course dates back to her work on colonial narratives and cultural dialogues, discoveries of India in the language of colonialism in the 1990s, along with I've suddenly gone blank on The Wayward Sisters. Of course, it was a sort of seminal publication co-edited in the 1990s with Dibna Callahan and other scholars, and then of course more recently the companion to the global renaissance, which I want to hold here to reach for another metaphor about Jyotsna providing some kind of, I don't know what the word, structure, basis, support for the field, because Spier has been wonderful in so many ways. The one thing that Spier has not provided us with is an appropriate lectern or podium or something similar. And yesterday, Colette, who won't mind me mentioning that she is of a certain height, was looking for something to put her laptop on, and we thought, we can't really use Jyotsna's book, can we? So we sort of tried, but then I thought it's actually a wonderful metaphor, because in a sense it's, evidence of, in this case, a physical example, but of you providing a kind of foundation or a basis for many other scholars to follow. So I mentioned that facetiously, but also in earnest. And then, of course, more recently, of course, Shakespeare and Postcolonial Theory is a volume that brings together so much of your work over the decades, and that has kind of rejuvenated a lot of scholarly discourse, and I guess asks, there was a risk perhaps in many different literary critical subfields that postcoloniality or postcolonialism as a theoretical perspective seemed to have sort of played out its use, and of course we realize that is certainly not the case, given that we live still in a neo-colonial setting in so many different contexts. So really inspiring to have that work to lead us. I'm going to stop there. I could speak at greater length, but we'd rather hear from Jyotsna. And Jyotsna, thank you once again.
Thank you.
We hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much. And thanks to Chris Thurman and Sandra Young, to my hosts, and to the Shakespeare Society of Southern Africa. And I'm actually very grateful that your journal was the first to review my postcolonial book. So I could see it outside. And for an invitation to share my work and to hear such wonderful, wide-ranging papers yesterday, including a keynote that is going to be a hard act to follow. I think Ruben is there. And I'm also talking about Hamlet, so I'm hoping we can have a little Hamlet conversation. I was remembering 1996. I had just begun my career out of graduate school, and so this was such a big event, and this was sponsored by the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And I was working on the materials on Shakespeare in India, then I used in my book that came out shortly. So it was a very, as an early career scholar, it was very important. And I think that conference made me see post-coloniality and colonial history and its ramifications as the sort of apartheid state was ending, and there was such a celebratory, welcome to President Mandela. And during that time, we went to Soweto and Durban and Cape Town, and I was there 3 weeks. So I had always wanted to come back, so I'm really grateful. And I think what I realized was the sort of weight of colonial history, because so we have Indians like me, and they're here, and other people are here, and our histories go back together, and it's like this anamorphic shadow of Vasco da Gama, I think. So yesterday our driver showed us the sort of where Cape of Good Hope was, which was discovering the passage along the African coast and seeds of empire, and how it all started in India. So it was very, very important to me. So today I'm actually very hopeful and excited, and I think unlike our discussion yesterday, I think that Shakespeare has been, since then and now, and is continuing to be decolonized, pluralized, and I think, as Ruben said, untethered from whiteness in various ways. And I believe that the attacks on us are because the sort of train has left the station. Or what genie back in the bottle, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And I think people know that you can't turn the page back. You can ban books or end the curriculum. So I always see that view, but that's something we can talk about. And the Tsikinya-Chaka Centre, or Shakespeare, he explained me the title, and the wonderful multilingual renditions of Shakespeare we saw in the factory, the drama factory, and Katie Vomero's work, and of course the Race Before Race, the major work coming out from there. I was delighted to see my friend Imtiaz Habib's book belatedly, finally, sadly after his passing, receiving the attention it deserved. And he and I used to be very good friends when Shakespeare Association was, if I can say, more white than it's now. And so we used to hang out. The global cinema work, my own work on post-colonial theory and on Shakespeare in India, and so I think I'm seeing it very positive and useful. And I think this intercultural imperative of Shakespeare dissemination is both global in extending its reach to yet newer parts of the world, and yet it's local in the sense of attending more closely to the indigenous native cultures and geopolitics. And before I go further, talking of local and global, I want to pay a special tribute to Martin Orkin, Professor Martin Orkin, who invited me all those years ago. And I'm sure in South Africa, I think his work was prescient, his work looked into the future, and his essay, Othello and the Plain Face of Racism, was really important. And the other person I also want to remember who was from Cape Town was Professor Nick Visser, who's, you may know him, whose article on Lear and the land around, Table Mountain, and he was my host in Cape Town when I came. And the third person I want to mention who is in England is Professor David Johnson, who wrote that very seminal book of Shakespeare in South Africa. So they are the people who kind of brought me here, and I think they were really important to what we are talking about today. So they're there somewhere. And I think my interest is in exploring the affective possibilities of a global Shakespeare as a transhistorical brand and yet embedded in specific histories, becoming native to other cultures, while dramatizing the cultural memories and the histories in, quote, voices and agents that exceed the canonical uses to which the works are put. And that's a quote from Craig Dion and Permita Kapadia in their very fine collection called Native Shakespeares, in which I wrote an afterword about my trip to Johannesburg. So that's a very important collection for me. And now today, I think, and the last sort of year, my work and thinking on these subjects are moving in new directions, not excluding in any way or reducing the value of the work that I have just mentioned, but in opening, I'm hoping, another path to decolonizing and pluralizing Shakespeare to lead us to social change and activism through poetry and through lyric thinking. And this is a term which I'm greatly indebted to Aisha Ramachandran's brilliant formulation. And in my Global Renaissance book, she's written an afterword on this very topic, the lyric thinking. And I think, as Sandra said yesterday, is how we can engage in new conversations between Shakespeare and other entities. And here I want to engage today in a conversation between Shakespeare and this South Asian poet, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who I always say better than Shakespeare, if I can say that, but as good as Shakespeare, in a dialogue across space, time, cultures, and languages. And so I'm going to, my paper is a little longer than I ever give papers, and it's sort of different sections. So first I enter this thing through the film Heather, which is an Indian rendition of of Hamlet. I'm mixing up my term. And it's a very, very important film because in this film, Hamlet is, tethered from his whiteness by becoming a Muslim and potentially being treated as a terrorist by the Indian military. And so this film is very important because there are poems of Faiz that have been interwoven in the film, both as songs and as kind of spoken, but you can play the songs a little bit. And then I want to compare another poem of Faiz with a sonnet of Shakespeare, so they're sort of different sections. And I think both Shakespeare and Faiz, in terms of their poetry, have a kind of common theme of the consolations and discontents of love. And sort of that's what I'm going to show in my readings, and how through this tension they kind of arrive at other ways of reaching out to the world. Now, the lyric thinking, or looking at this new way of looking at the lyric, I think what Aisha Ramachandran says, and I'm just broadly summing up, that unlike narrative or dramatic forms which have long been at the heart of literary scholarship on early modern globality, the lyric poem has seemed to stand apart. Its focus on first-person voice and experience and subjectivity has appeared to ignore or elide the pressure of the material world beyond the self. The situated hyper-local particularity of the lyric often stands in opposition to the epistemology of the global turn, which emphasizes vastness, spatial crossing, multitudes. But what might be the affordances and limitations of bringing lyric poetry into conversation with the global turn in early modern studies? And I think that's the work that I'm really interested in, and how you can relate lyric poetry and the experience to the material world and social justice. So I'll just, I had sort of summed it up here, and I will read it aloud. This is just, sum up what I've already said, is that I drew on the themes of the conference to follow Shakespeare's travels and explore his legacies in South Asia and in the global South Asian diasporas, and to generate a dialogue between Shakespeare's Hamlet and one sonnet and key poems by Ahmed Faiz across space and time. And on the right hand, I think just what I've said is, what I've highlighted is, I'm interested in exploring the affective possibilities of a global Shakespeare that becomes native to other cultures. And my focus today is to ask, what work does poetry do? How does poetry work in terms of empire, colonialism, and social justice? But specifically, I think the focus I want in terms of lyric thinking is, what discussions can we have about the meaning, nature, the very possibility of lyric verse in the early modern period, as well as in our own times? And I think, at least I'm very interested in contemporary poetry, and we were talking of avant-garde poetry and how the lyric voice permeates that poetry. The work of Helen Wendler I always find useful in approaching the sort of formation of the subject and self and the voice. And lyric thinking is a unique conjunction, as I've said, of particular and universalizing modes of thinking in the lyric, as it enables us to articulate a phenomenology of worldly experience, how individuals explore and inhabit a shifting world. And the next point is really important, is this allows us a new focus on who speaks and how they speak, which voices get heard and how they get heard in the world. And if we apply these questions to lyric poetry, they will bring around very important answers and lead us back into the world rather than into the lyric. A lyric thinking, and this is very much my belief, stirs an ethical and empathetic imagination. And the key here is not to flatten the phenomenology of experience in the lyric into ideological agendas, but also to ask, what is the role of the lyric poet and poetry in the world, and how the poet and we as readers can engage with the fraught social world via the poems. Both Ahmed Faiz and Shakespeare raise these questions in their poetry, in their sonnets, and in Faiz's lyric poems interwoven into Hamlet. So next I will introduce you to the film Hamlet and the relationship between the poetic vision of Shakespeare and Ahmed Faiz through Hamlet, through Heather. I'm blurring the boundaries there. The film Heather lyrically opens up the play to local knowledges, voices, and experiences of Kashmir under occupation by the Indian military state and a very draconian kind of police surveillance state during the Civil War of the 1990s. It was called a civil war, but it was also a proxy war between India and Pakistan being played out. What is imaginatively invoked in Shakespeare's Hamlet, the unweeded garden that grows to seed with things rank and gross possessing it, is visualized quite literally in the film in the scenes of destruction and sterility in Heather. If Shakespeare's Hamlet is the ultimate metonymy of the tragic early modern, we see, and for the formation of the individual subject, as we see in Hamlet's psychic struggles, Bhardwaj's Heather creates a tragic subjectivity in which the personal is repeatedly imbricated in the historical, cultural, and political currents that both underlie and shape the Kashmir militancy and occupation. Heather also very interestingly challenges the revenge genre. In some ways, it is all about revenge, revenging Heather's father, and also, the revenge of the Kashmir against the occupation. But it interrogates the revenge genre. And throughout the film, two terms are woven: intiqam, which means revenge, and azadi, which means freedom. That can you have real freedom through revenge? So it really problematizes the figure of the revenging hero, which is very crucial. I think those of you who don't know a little more about this militancy, is the Indian state kind of occupied and had this horrendous policy of dividing brother into, by brother, dividing households. And it was called of infiltrating households and making relatives spy on each other. And the other thing that was very common is like you have in the West Bank, is blasting homes in which suspected terrorists lived. So Heather's home is destroyed, and his father's disappeared and then dies. So it's very similar. And the villain is his uncle, who is the governor, who becomes the governor. So it's very much clear. And then the second point is all of Kashmir is a prison, like all of Denmark is a prison. And so this is an example where it seems like very far removed from Shakespeare's Hamlet, but actually it picks on all the right kinds of point of tension, except it really turns its head on the revenge genre. And I won't give you a spoiler alert because you have to see the ending. So I think if Chris can play for us, so what we have is 2 clips here. One is we have a trailer, which is about 3 minutes, and then there's a basic poem of Faiz's that runs through the whole film. And you'll hear it in Urdu, a bit of that song that plays, and we can hear about 2 minutes. So this is something that you would enjoy. And the film is spliced with a lot of violence, and it's kind of interesting. can see, I think they've spliced a lot of the violence together. But the main point, which I can bring back later too, that the whole interiority of Hamlet's mind that is so central to Shakespeare's play is kind of not available to Heather. So the to be or not to be speech becomes a kind of public reflection. And the interior psychic world that we have in Shakespeare's play is impossible in this rendering. Yeah, so let's hear the music. And these are lyrics of Faiz, the poet that I will introduce you to.
बड़ा है दर्द का रिश्ता बड़ा है दर्द का रिश्ता दर्द का रिश्ता बड़ा है दर्द का रिश्ता बड़ा है दर्द का रिश्ता बड़ा है दर्द का रिश्ता ये दिल गरीब सही तुम्हारे नाम पे आएंगे गम गुसार चले गुलों में रंग भरे बादलों बहार चले गुलों में रंग भरे बादलों बहार चले चले भी आओगे गुलशन का कारोबार चले चले भी आओगे गुलशन का कारोबार चले
Thank you. So the last couplet here you hear throughout the film. Gulshan, come into the garden, and I just translate it. And it's again the image of the garden is blooming, but if you don't come, it'll be ruined. And this is his father, Hyder's father used to sing this, and later on when he's in prison, and this weaves through Hamlet's consciousness. So I will look at some of the poems that these are scenes from the film. This is Hamlet with his mother. This is a great Indian movie actress, Ghazala, she's the Gertrude is called Ghazala, and the other one is the uncle and her at their wedding. And he's a brilliant actor who acts as Claudius. He's very kind of attractive and appealing and really criminal. It's wonderfully done. One second. So these are the two poems that are in the film, the two Faiz poems. So the interesting thing about the film is that although it's a political story, it's structured through poetry. Not only by Faiz's poetry, but there's another famous poet called Agha Shahid Ali who died recently, who's a translator of Faiz, and he has written a major poem on Kashmir called The Country Without a Post Office, which I often teach actually. It's a collection of poems, but there's a long poem. So the scenes, if you go to the scene of his bombed out, you see all these bombed out houses. And one of the scenes where we don't see here, he recollects in a flashback a scene with his father singing and quizzing him on the Urdu couplet, which is this song. Gulon mein rang bhare baade no bahar chale, chale bhi aao ke gulshan ka karobar chale. And these are beautiful lines. So the one is the sort of new breeze of spring fills blossoms with their hue. Come now, my love, grant the garden to leave to go about its business. So they use the word karobar, which is business, which is very out of place in romantic poetry. And that is what Faiz is very, kind of unique, that he mixes the metaphors quite like metaphysical poets. And this weaves through. The other poem, which is hard to find in translation, is a poetic epilogue during the credits. And this is another second poem of Faiz called Intisab, which means dedication. And this is possibly written about Pakistan, though generally it's considered complete, and it is used to eulogize my country, implying Kashmir or India. And this is like Aaj ke naam or Aaj ke gam ke naam, Aaj ka gam hai ki zindagi ke bhare gulstan se khafa, zard patton ka ban jo mera desh hai, dard ki anjuman jo mera desh hai. And the translation is about the grief that again shuns the blooming garden of life, and the country has become a forest of yellow leaves. the forest of yellow leaves, dying leaves, that is my country, to the constellation of pain, that is my country. So the film defiantly keeps alive the story of social justice and equity and freedom, even beyond the final frame. And this is a contrast to Shakespeare's Hamlet, where despite the many dead bodies strewn on stage and the impending conquest of Denmark, it is in the end largely the protagonist's tragedy, though there can be a lot of discussion about how universal it is. So I think moving on, sorry, this is Faiz in his young days. He didn't look as good as before he died. He had been in prison, I think for 2 years once and then for 4 years. And the reason I say that with a certain irony is that he was a chain smoker and he drank, he sort of lived the good life, and you could see. But if you go on YouTube, you can find clips of him reciting his poems. And he was like phenomenally organic. He would sit at a gathering and just recite the most complex poems, as if he was just thinking through them. And he was, I think, a really, really a great figure. So I'm just going to look at 2 poems, and there's a cultural translation between the 2 poems of Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and the poem is called Mujhse Pehli Si Mohabbat, is Do Not Ask Me for That Love Again. And this is an iconic poem through sort of pan-South Asia, through diasporas. People in London, maybe people in South Africa, I think would know this poem. And one common theme in both Faiz and Shakespeare's sonnets is love and its discontents, where their most intense poetic accomplishments are examinations of subjective states of their speakers, personas created by them. And permeating the fraught exigencies of desire in both poems are complex political explorations of all relationships and how to navigate love and desire in a world of injustice and loss. So the poem that I will read in English, and then I was inspired by our presentation on the first day about Romeo and Juliet and so forth, that I will read the bit in Urdu later on. So in English it is, do not ask me for that love again. That which then was ours, my love, don't ask me for that love again. The world then was gold, burnished with light, and only because of you. That's what I had believed. How could one weep for sorrows other than yours? How could one have any sorrows but the one you gave? So what were these protests, these rumors of injustice? A glimpse of your face was evidence of springtime. The sky, wherever I looked, was nothing but your eyes. If you'd fall into my arms, fate would be helpless. All this I thought, all this I believed, but there are other sorrows, comforts other than love. And then the second part of the poem is shifting to a much darker world. The rich had cast their spell on history. Dark centuries had been embroidered on brocades and silk. Bitter threads began to unravel before me as I went into the alleys and in open markets, saw bodies plastered with ash, bathed in blood. I saw them sold and bought again and again. This too deserves attention. I can't help but look back when I return from these alleys. What can one do? And you are still so ravishing. What can I do? What can one do? There are other sorrows in this world, comforts other than love. Do not ask me, my love, for that love again. And this poem, really resonates the sort of tensions. And I'll quickly read it in Urdu just to, you can get a feel of the language. And translation is always difficult, but I think this is a translation by Agha Shahid Ali, and you get about 70%, I think, of the poem. You get a sense. So in Urdu it is, मुझसे पहली सी मोहब्बत मेरे महबूब न मांग, मैंने समझा था कि तू है दरख्शां है हयात, तेरा गम है तो शाम दहर का झगड़ा ही क्या, तेरी सूरत से है आलम में बहारों को सबात, तेरी आँखों के सिवा दुनिया में रखा क्या है, तू जो मिल जाए तो तकदीर निगूं हो जाए, यूं ना था मैंने फ़कत चाहा था यूं हो जाए, और भी दुख हैं ज़माने में मोहब्बत के सिवा, राहतें और भी हैं वस्ल की राहत के सिवा, अनगिनत सदियों के तारीख पैमाना तिलिस्म, रेशम व अतलसे ओ ख्वाब में बुनवाए हुए, जा बेजा बिकते हुए कूचो ओ बाज़ार में जिस्म, खाक में लिथरे हुए खून में नहलाए हुए, जिस्म निकले हुए अमराज के तनूरों से, पीप बहती हुई जलते हुए नसूरों से, लौट जाती है उधर को भी नज़र क्या कीजिए, अब भी दिलकश है तेरा हुस्न मगर क्या कीजिए. And this line is, after all this suffering, I keep looking back at the suffering. Lord jati hai udhar. I mean, that's where I keep looking in that direction. What can I do? And he doesn't use any specific pronoun. He says kya kijiye. It could be I or it could be we. He elides that. Ab bhi dilkash hai tera husn magar kya kijiye. And yet you're so beautiful, but I can't help looking at that. And then the fast, ab bhi dukh hai aur zamane mein mohabbat ke siwa. There are other sufferings other than love. Rahatein aur bhi hain wasl ki rahat ke siwa, and fulfillments other than love. Mujhse pehli si mohabbat mere mehboob na maang. So you can see the way, and it's all through repetition and very Persianized vocabulary that, even I had to kind of always get my head around. So we'll move on to the Shakespeare sonnet, which is sonnet 37, and I have it here. And then I can talk about both the poems together. Let's see, maybe I can just read here. This is sonnet 57, and some people call it the slave sonnet, and I always use the word slave in very historicized way and very problematic ways because it conjures up a lot of history, and I can talk about that later. Being your slave, what should I do but tend upon the hours and times of your desire? I have no precious time at all to spend, nor services to do till you require. Nor dare I chide the world without end hour, whilst I, my sovereign, watch the clock for you, nor think the bitterness of absence sour, when you have bid your servant once adieu. Nor dare I question with my jealous thought, where you may be or your affairs suppose, but like a sad slave, stay and think of naught, save where you are, how happy you make those. So true a fool is love, that in your will, though you do anything, he thinketh no ill. So taking these poems together, how am I bringing them together, and why am I bringing them together, and what do we get out of that? So I think, if you look at Do Not Ask Me for That Love Again, here we find the poetic persona, torn between exquisite demands of unrequited love and those of the larger oppressions around him. And Faiz himself spoke about this particular poem as a turning point in his aesthetic development, marking a kind of dissatisfaction with the dominant romantic strain in Urdu poetry. He wrote his best poetry when he was imprisoned. I think this was in his early imprisonment. And so in this poem, the dominant mood is set by the speakers asking the beloved not to ask for the love formally given, pehli si mohabbat, a singular love alert to nothing but the beloved's charms and cruelties. The speaker lists the efficacies of this love in which he had formerly believed, and concludes the first section of the poem with a confession: if it was not true all this but wishing, after noting the cruelties of the outer world, its injustice, alienation, and inequality, with which the beloved must compete for the speaker's love and attention. And then before, I didn't want to spend, for the reason of time, Faiz, died in 1984, and he was a part of the Indian progressive writers movement. They were writers, artists, poets, and they were all in those days communists or left-wing, people, and they were very much involved in the kind of nation India and Pakistan would become. And he had an amazing education. On one hand, he studied with a Maulvi and studied Arabic and classical Persian, but he also did a degree in English and Arabic, and he also knew, probably Latin. He probably read Shakespeare and Tolstoy. And the very interesting fact, which I think people from Pakistan would find, that his Arabic tutor was the same tutor of Muhammad Iqbal, who was the great poet of Pakistan. Except when he taught Faiz, he was like 100 years old, and when he taught Iqbal, he was very young. So there's that wonderful, Muhammad Iqbal was another amazing poet. And so there's this great link of the lineage. So I always say this is the education we all need, the English and Arabic and so forth. So now come to Shakespeare's poem, and sort of we'll end there. So here, can the word slave be innocuous, a metaphor for the speaker's emotional state of helplessness at the whim of another person's desire? And here, for instance, in this particular poem, the speaker or the persona casts himself as a slave, not simply as a supplicant, but I think clearly as a slave tending to the desires of the addressee. Enslavement to a single person, acknowledging to being wholly subservient physically and mentally to his young friend in a singular, not in a general institutional condition. The addressee is the sovereign, the center of power, which I think in his earlier sonnet 33, he also develops this imagery of the sun. And articulating his servitude, the speaker in Shakespeare's sonnet expresses a convoluted comfort, evoking the bitterness of absence of his enslaving beloved. He will not allow it to sour him once the former has bid him once adieu. So can the word slave be innocuous, a metaphor for the speaker's emotional state of helplessness at the whim of another's desires or demands? Or can one also consider the speaker being a slave of his own desires, a construction of jealousy for his addressee? And I think here, what is really remarkable is the sonnet always reminds us that it is the enslaved person who has the speaking voice here, who has the lyric voice. So no matter how you look at this enslavement relationship, it is the voice of the sad slave. Helen Wendler sees this poem as a shadow poem where you can deduce from the speaker's actual statement what he would really like to say to the young man if he could speak. And what kind of judgment would he make about your affairs as he tells him. And some occupations of the addressee that may be bringing jealous thoughts into him. And so I think how you can read the sonnet is purely subjective, but is there a way of reading, letting this lyric voice lead us out from the sonnet? Though the summation about the folly of the relationship occurs in the third person, yet it is the slave's voice that you hear. So how does one address the pedagogy of this particular poem? And here I would like to draw out and expand the social meanings of this lyric self by noticing the resonances of the word slave. And I'm using Patricia Akimi's wonderful article called Cultivating Expertise, Glossing Shakespeare and Race, and offering some kind of pedagogical glossing exercise. If you read the poem through the lens of enslavement practices, through the history of the slave trade, through Hawkins' slaving voyages, and expand the interconnecting contextual links between the word slave and other words in Shakespeare like blackamoor, savage, devil, and deformed slave. So this is, I think, one way of using the lyric voice to take us beyond. In terms of Faiz's poem, when I teach the film Heather, I always draw the students to talk about cultural literacy and how we all want to direct our activism and social work in a global context, but many times, at least my students, I think lack the cultural vocabulary and cultural literacy. So in both senses, my point is that if we follow these lyric voices, the phenomenology of the lived experience, we can always ask this question: is who speaks, who is allowed to speak, who is listening, and what we can do about it. Thank you. And I would love to hear what you think.
Thank you so much, Jyotsna. I wish that the load shedding clock had struck 2 minutes later, but we were all attentive to your every word as you concluded there. Thank you so much. It's really interesting for those of us who know something about Haida, but not really enough, as I was saying to you earlier, to feel confident in teaching it to our students or speaking about it. We often have recourse to, I suppose, what seems the more documentary or journalistic side, the sort of Basharat Pir curfewed night aspect, and of course the Shakespeare adaptation. What you've showed us here today is that we can all too easily slip into that, perhaps into an emphasis on the spectacle of Kashmir, which, as we were saying at dinner last night, is a familiar to many South Africans. The debates in the 1980s about is the job of the writer or the artist to document what is there, or is it to think of alternatives, and that's of course a sort of false binary, as you've demonstrated talking about lyric poetry today. So thank you so much for that. Questions? We have a roving mic which can rove all the way to the back to preserve your comments for posterity. Do you mind, Steve? Let's.
Thank you, Jyotsna, for such a wonderful and sort of elevating paper so early in the morning. I was really struck by when you were reading the poem in Urdu, and that sort of the rhythms and the cadences and the kind of the sort of serenity of the rhythms. And then you sort of mentioned the kind of the Persian influence there, and it really reminds me of Hafez and that sort of
exactly.
And the kind of the speaking of the poetry in the Farsi. And I just wondered, then it's kind of just got me to thinking how much in kind of adaptation of kind of contemporary adaptation of Hamlet or of Shakespeare in general, how much do people who are doing the adaptation or contemporary audiences, how much are they happy to engage with the rhythms of the language, which are so often the things that get lost in modern adaptations?
Thank you so much. I'm really glad you mentioned Hafiz, because again, this was all the sort of collective imaginary of South Asia and coming from Persia. You know, my own father, who passed away a few years ago in his 90s, could recite Ghalib and Iqbal. He thought Faiz was lesser than Iqbal, you know, his mind. But everything went back to Hafiz and Firdausi. So it was this wonderful, which is what I find really attractive and appealing. I think Heather, he did something else in Heather that he hasn't done in his other film, Maqbool and Omkara, which is on Othello and Macbeth, which are also, I think, very interesting and worth seeing. And so I would suggest it depends. I think the diasporic audiences seeing it in London or somewhere else may not get the Urdu and the rhythms so much. But I know that in the subcontinent, this would be very moving. And the translator is Aga Shahid Ali, who I used to know him, who died very young. He was a very gifted poet who wrote The Country Without a Post Office. And he has done the best translations of Faiz, because he used to write ghazals in English. So I think and this is to me what is rich about this film compared to the others, that it's a film in which politics are woven through poetry. So my motto for many years is poets will save the world, and we don't need politicians. So that's why I've really been drawn to poetry. I think because I was more political, I think. And I just feel we need poets.
So let's have a look at other hands so I can be aware of it. One in the front. Should I be coming to the back?
Sorry.
Here we go. Thanks, Lauren.
I'm just looking at the comparison between the two poems. So what I got out of the first one was that he's saying to his lover, there are other things in the world that I need to focus on. I can't give all my attention to you. And then in the second one, for me it seems like the opposite. He's saying, no matter what goes on in the world, I'm just focused on you. So I found that quite interesting, that contrast. Do you also see some overlapping between them, or how do you compare them and contrast them?
I think that's such a brilliant question. And that's the whole thing about lyric poetry, is that, and you know, when you teach sonnets or you teach poetry in class, how you look at the construction of the persona. And certainly, you know, he is doing that, you know, very much focused on his addressee, and he's a supplicant. But I think how I saw it also is that it's such a dynamic of a slave-master relationship, although it's in the form of desire, that in a way it's forcing us, you know, who is speaking, why are they speaking? Faiz's poem is very explicitly political. I think this is in some ways it's become iconic. Everybody in South Asia would know this poem, because there he said, this is the world, and the images in Urdu sound very graphic, of pus, of people bleeding, of bodies being sold. You know, you could think of some really depressing alley of brothels somewhere. I mean, it's a very graphic, vivid scene. So he said, this is what I'm seeing, and then there is your beauty. And I can't leave that. Some people read The Beloved as a metaphor, which I just don't believe. I think that's the tension of Faiz's poetry. These are not metaphors, these are real desires. There's real beauty, and this is the real suffering. And there is no reconciliation, except he's telling the beloved that I can't go back again. That cannot happen. But that's exactly, I think, that following these lyric voices, I think, frees us in our teaching in a way. You know, work all until recently has been quite political. And I tell my students, I used to be a Marxist, now I'm a Sufi. Quite really, because I think too much Marxism. So your answer, I mean, I think that's a really good way of, too much, there's never too much Marxism in a sense.
Another question, I think we have time. Even though we started a little late, we can fit in another question. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Jyotsna. I want to go back to the excuse me, to the trailer, because I got very interested in Shakespeare film trailers a little while ago and started writing about them. This seems to me a perfect exemplification of the trailer that is not trailing the movie, of course. But the absence of interiority also addresses a central tension in any Hamlet movie, however close or distant from the play, which is how do you represent in film the kind of interiority that theatre makes easily practicable? So I really want to ask you about the place of lyric as a space of interiority in relation then to the absence of it in a trailer which is simply representing the film as violent, shoot-em-up action movie.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent question, and I had originally planned, and I couldn't find my DVD the day I was leaving, is to showing a different scene, I noticed. But then I thought, since if people haven't seen Hamlet, they can see, and I think that's exactly. So what happens in this film is that the speeches, the to be or not to be, he's very cognizant of the speeches because he says, he uses the we, hum hai ke nahi, am I, are we or not to, are we or not to be, sort of be. But using the poems, I think, especially this Gulo mein rang bhare, it gives the interiority of his bond with his father. And this line, Gulo mein rang bhare badeyan, bahar chale chale bhi aao. So that keeps running again and again and again. So that brings the whole idea of remember me, the father-son relationship. And for those who haven't seen the movie, they do a very interesting thing about the ghost. So instead of having the father's ghost, they have a character called Rudar, which means the spirit man. And it's this, he's also a militant and he wears sunglasses because he was tortured with his father. So he tracks down Heather and says, your father died and remember him. So it's the lyric voices, it's the poetry that, so Heather doesn't have a moment in a room himself to reflect, but it's through the poetry that is seeping through in this particular couplet and some of the other, scenes around him, which has very nice dialogue about Kashmir and so forth. So that gives the interiority. That gives the sort of evocative inner space over there. Yes, go ahead.
Can I pass this over before you speak? Thanks, Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Jyotsna, for such a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed your interweaving of these lyric voices, and I'm particularly interested in lyric poetry myself. And when I think about its origins, well, sonnets especially, in early writers like Petrarch, I was just thinking as you were speaking about how in this particular poem, there's a do not ask me to return to. There are other
comforts other than love or sorrows other than love.
Yes, and it made me think about the very last of Petrarch's sonnets in his Canzoniere, in which he ultimately renounces his love for Laura and begs God to intercede for him. And he says that ultimately the only comfort in his approaching death is that he should have his salvation in God and not in Laura. And I just find it very interesting that in these poems in which there is a beloved or there is a focal point, that there might be a point at which the speaker turns away from the object of their desire towards something else, comfort, suffering, or even something godly or holy.
Sure.
Yeah, so that was just a comment.
I think that's wonderful, and I will go back to Petrarch. I think not only Petrarch, but I teach a lot of sonnets, so I like Sydney sonnets, Astrophel to Stella and Wyatt's. And I actually love Mary Roth. I love her, what is it? Pamphylia to Amphilanthus. I teach those all the time, the Corona sonnets. And that is, look at that, consolations and discontents. But I more and more think the sonnets are not as interior, all about subjectivity. They're going in all kinds of different places. And the speakers are often tired and want something else. And they, I think, subsume it in the form and the poetry. So there's just so much possibility. And in Urdu poetry, the poem that I read is a nazm. It's a sort of non-narrative poem. But of course, a lot of the Urdu Arabic poetry is the ghazal, which is very much like a sonnet. It's structured in very strict couplets. And I know Rob Stagg is doing work where the sonnet and the ghazal at some faraway point had connections, in Italy or in Sicily or somewhere.
Yes.
There's a whole theory about this, which I don't know enough about, but it's worth pursuing. So I hope that one can look more at poetry. This is a very recent thing in the last 3 or 4, 5 years. I've been very drawn to looking at this, and then Aisha's article really made me think of it. There's another subfield that I don't know enough about. It's called lyric studies, and it's a lot in Victorian literature. There's several books. But I think that is doing something slightly different. That is basically saying more generally that the lyric needs to address the world and address politics. But I think what she is moving us is to the phenomenology of the experience, with differing responses, in which spaces can open up, maybe not the same for everyone. Obviously, I read Urdu with a different feeling, and you would read Italian, with a different feeling. And that is why, which is, I think, going to be a part. And she's actually learning Urdu and Persian. She's amazing. So I first time did this talk in London in the Renaissance Centre, Hannah Crawford. The whole series was on poetry, the whole term. And so that really got me started. So I'm very grateful to them. But thank you. That was, that's a very good question, and I should go back to translations of Petrarch. Any other comments?
With the concluding expansive question that takes us in other directions, it's a reminder of how, Jyotsna, you've taken a starting point, if we think of that as one starting point, as Hamlet, that we're all familiar with, and Hader, perhaps few of us familiar with, and we realize that we can sort of pursue the conversation in so many different directions. I really feel like we were talking yesterday about how students, pleasure doesn't have to be part of the benefit of studying, but there are those rare occasions we can all remember as undergraduates when you really love something, and then you have a brilliant lecturer who teaches you so much more about it, and it's a kind of constantly renewing pleasure. And for me, the film Hader is a bit like that. And as you were speaking about it, again, the great pleasure of the work itself, is something that we can enjoy, not just from the clips, but from your insights into it. And you show us so many more avenues to pursue. So that was such a wonderful way of starting our day, and we thank you for a spur to many more conversations, which will continue over tea and coffee and throughout the day.
Thank you very much.
A final round of applause for Jyotsna.
Thank you.